Shh. All right, today we are finishing our discussion about sampling. Last week we talked about methods of random sampling, and we had 4 different types of random samples. Raise your hand if you remember one of those types. Katie, what do you remember? Cluster sampling. Jacob? Stratified sampling. Systematic sampling. What's the gold standard? Simple random. There we go. So cluster, stratified, those are the 2 groupings. And then systematic and simple random. Raise your hand if you can explain the difference between a cluster sample and a stratified sample. I've already called on you 2, so thank you for volunteering. I want a new voice. Just trying to...
For stratified sampling, you split the populations into like groups, but then for cluster sampling, there are groups that like already exist, but you might do the group. Yeah, it's like the subgroups.
Good. So for stratified, we the researcher are making that decision on how we're going to group the population by some characteristic that we are interested in. Whereas cluster sampling, typically the groups already exist, and ideally we want them to be as identical as possible. Good. Very good. Today, we are going to talk about samples that are not random. And we're going to look at what they are and why statisticians typically do not use them. So the 2 methods we're going to talk about today are convenience samples and voluntary response samples. And as you can see, statisticians are not very creative with their naming. Those are what they sound like. A convenience sample is a sample that uses subjects that are easy for the researcher to access. For example, when I was a statistics student at Hartnell College in the late 90s, Professor Perkins had us do a semester project, and we had to compare 2 different data sets. So I compared the GPA versus hours of study at students at North High and Alvarez. And to collect that data, I sat in a chair and I talked to kids as they walk by at lunch. That was not a random sample. I did not have a plan ahead of time. I sat in a chair with a clipboard and talked to kids as they walked by. That was easy for me to do. I just happened to talk to people who were within hearing my voice. Yeah, that would be a convenience sample. A voluntary response sample is also what it sounds like. People volunteer to be part of the sample. You will hear a phrase when it comes to voluntary response samples. That phrase is self-select. The subjects self-select. In all of our other sampling methods, the researcher selects the subjects. For voluntary response, the subject self-selects to be in the sample. For example, at Fresno State while I was an undergrad, the psychology department would do studies, and they would put out a call to all students to participate in those studies so they could collect data. They would offer you like a $10 stipend or some snacks, and students would choose to participate. And so I went and I got hooked up to a breathing monitor, and they asked me some questions, and I got my $10. Yay. But I chose to be part of that study. I made the conscious decision when I saw the ad to walk to the psychology building and do the whole interview process. And the question is, why do we see or say that this is a poor sample? Why do we not use these? So hold that thought. So I want you to discuss in your group. I'm going to give you about 90 seconds, and I want you to articulate what the risks of using these types of samples are. What are the downsides? Why don't we generally use them to do stats? I'm going to give you 90 seconds. I'm going to call in a couple people. Why is this bag so heavy? Oh, because I have a ton of food. That's why. Oh, and I have tape here. That goes to Silo. That goes to Silo. Put your phone away. Have we talked to each other? Actually? I'm going to call on that table first. You guys are going first.
I thought it was just me behind, but I checked everyone else.
Remind me after we do this discussion, and we'll go back up and fill that. Thank you for reminding me. Did we talk to each other? Okay. All right, Josh, what did your table discuss? What are the risks of this type of sampling method? Ooh. Very good. There is a potential that we are going to underrepresent certain subsections of our population. Good. Anyone else? Yes, Katie.
For voluntary response variable specifically, one of the reasons that it may not be a good test is because certain types of experiments or certain types of studies are going to attract certain types of people. But I know one of the biggest problems in this respect, and so like the Stanford business experiment, was that when they put out the ad, then like, hey, you want to be in person with me? Like that's gonna get a certain type of person, maybe someone who's just like science, someone who's interested in criminal justice, someone who wants to be a barbecue, someone who wants money, that kind of thing. And it's variable. It gives you more variables to test than less randomized. Like it's I don't think people going to that experiment are going to be going to like I don't know My Little Pony show tonight. Like those are going to be two different groups of people, and then it's not as randomized because there's a single variable among many of these studies.
Very good. And I like that you use the Stanford prison experiment because that was a whole lot of questionable stats going on there. Very good. So voluntary response, particularly, you have to be conscious of one, who has access to your survey, and two, the types of responses it is likely to elicit. If we are doing a survey of patrons of your restaurant, when you hand out that survey on every check, who are the most likely people to respond to those surveys? So people who are very unhappy and want to let you know about it, or people who had an absolutely stellar experience and want to let you know about it. The middle chunk of people who are just in there to dine, enjoyed their food, and left, they're just going to crumple up that receipt and throw it in the trash, right? Most people, unless their opinion is very strong in one way or the other, don't respond. Right, which is why you tend to get bimodal distributions when you look at distributions online. People loved it, people hated it, the people in the middle didn't bother to respond. So voluntary, that's a very possible reaction. For both voluntary and convenience, that underrepresentation is a concern. Very good. We have to keep in mind as statisticians that when we collect samples, we want our samples to be representative of the population we pulled them from. Yes, Katie.
Sorry, another one I thought of is because like in like AP11 now we're going over like the Logan studies and that, and I think something that's mentioned in a lot of psychology experiments is I can't remember the phrase, but it's when a subject knows they are being tested for something and tries to aid in reaching that hypothesis. So if they want, like if the researcher wants them to react a certain way, they're going to do specific things that they won't normally do.
And we're going to come to that later in this lesson. So yes, that is another issue, but not tied to this type of sampling. Good. Very good. Somebody pointed out we left off a little blank at the top here that I forgot to address last time, which is note. So the note is that the goal of our sampling is to ensure that our method of selection is random and that the resulting sample is representative. And randomization helps with the representation thing. It also helps with other things that we will talk about on another day. But randomization is important and that the resulting sample is representative. All right. Questions before we move on to the next page? No. All right. So next page is where we start talking about that other thing that Katie brought up. And it has to do with bias. And not in the general sense, not in the English sense, but specifically in the statistics sense. A statistical study shows bias if it very likely underestimates or overestimates the thing you are trying to measure or assess. For example, if I am interested in the height of students at Rancho San Juan and I only survey the male basketball and volleyball players, that is going to very likely overestimate the average height of students at Rancho San Juan. That would be a bias. There are lots of potential ways that bias can seep into our studies. We're going to talk about a couple of them, but first I want us to consider an example. Somebody with a nice loud reading voice. Thank you, Drew.
In 2016, Britain's Natural Environment Research Council invited the public to name its $300 million polar relationship. To vote on the name, people simply needed to visit a website and record their choice. Ignoring the name suggested by the council, more than 124,000 people voted for Bodie McVoteface, which ended up having more than 3 times as many votes as the second place finisher. What type of sample did the council use in their poll? Explain how bias in the sampling method could have affected the poll results.
Thank you, Drew. So your group is considering 2 things. What type of sample? How is bias potentially present in this situation? I'm going to put 2 minutes on the clock. I want you to discuss those 2 questions in your group. Yeah? I'm going to use my random name caller to call on some people.
That and also a lot, including myself, like that controversial piece of answer. This is
It's on the second line.
No, like it makes me want to laugh. Yes. It's very good to
and during advisory.
It's like you're voting.
Put it in your pocket. Frowny face. Frowny face. There are two of them, which is what type of sample was used in the example and how is bias potentially present in the study. Type of sample and bias. Type of sample and bias. Mm. Mm. In each column, pick one number, and there's 10 columns, so 10. 10. All right. Let's see who can tell us what type of sample this is. Ashley's not here. Valeria, what type of sample is used in this example? I'll give you a hint. It's one of the two we talked about today. Valeria says voluntary response. Give me a thumbs up if you agree with Valeria. I see thumbs up around the room. Very good. Voluntary. They posted a survey online. People simply needed to visit a website, record their choice. Very good. So people had a choice of whether they went to the survey or not and filled it out. Good. And then we address, types of bias that may or may not be present. Katie, type of bias that might be present.
They did not want the name to be I wonder if even the names that were suggested by the were even right, like even placed in the top 10. Yeah.
Good. So people potentially were giving nonsense answers and not taking the survey seriously. That is a type of bias. Very good. Jade, give me another one. Thoughts? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with how we administered the survey. How were people accessing this survey? Through a website. Does everybody have a computer? No. Lots of people may not have access to a computer, may not have access to a cell phone, may not have access to internet. Good. Different types of bias. Did anybody come up with an explanation that's not up there for a type of bias that might be present? Yes. I'm not sure that would be a type of bias, but yes, the researcher choosing to eliminate answers could be personal bias. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
It could be like hate, kind of. Not hate, but like how did you know? Because it's in Britain, right? They're American or they're like,
So people intentionally taking the survey
yeah.
who aren't. Yeah. So I'm tempted to put another vote here because it falls in that same category, just a different spirit. Yeah. Very good. Very, very good. So a couple of things. One, when we talk about populations and representative samples, this second one is a very important concern. As a researcher, you have to consider that a portion of your population may be living in poverty, meaning they don't have access to computers, they don't have access to cell phones, they don't have access to internet, they may not have reliable power, right? They may be homeless and don't have a permanent address. How do you get in touch with those people to ensure that they're represented in your sample? That's super important if you're doing things like public policy or public health or medical studies. Yeah. So things that as a researcher you need to consider. All right. The other one, the made up silly names, those fall into other sources of bias. We will talk about a couple of the more common ones. So the first is under coverage. So under coverage is when some members of the population are less likely to be chosen for the sample or cannot be chosen for the sample. An example of under coverage would be people who don't have internet access in our Bodie McBoatface example. Relating to nonsense answers, it's down here at the bottom. Let's see what's the next one. Non-response. There we go. Non-response is the next one. Non-response occurs when an individual chosen for the sample cannot be contacted or refuses to participate. And you will notice that there is a note beneath non-response that says, do not use the term voluntary response to explain why certain individuals don't respond in a sample survey. The question is why? What is the difference between somebody not responding in a sample survey and voluntary non-response? Where is the difference? Why are we making separate categories for voluntary response studies and everybody else? I'm going to give you about 60 seconds in your small groups, and then we're going to come together. Why is there a difference between voluntary and non-response?
So incapable of responding. Meanwhile, there's some people who don't want to respond, can't respond, don't want to respond, can't.
All right, let's go ahead and come back. I saw Jacob's hand go up. What are you thinking, Jacob?
Oh, just like if it's voluntary, they're like self-selecting, but if they're not responsive, they've already been selected and they were meant to respond, but they just didn't.
Very good. Spot on. So voluntary, whoops, that people choosing to be part of the survey or not part of the survey is a feature of the sample type. Participate. I know how to spell. That is a feature, a defining feature of a voluntary survey. They make the decision on their own. Non-response is when researcher has selected them and that person chooses not to participate. Come on, pen. Has to do with who's doing the choosing. So voluntary is when the person had the choice to participate in the first place. Non-response are for those types of surveys where I am calling on people. So all four of those randomized methods. And convenience, where I'm making a choice, the researcher's in control of who they talk to. That's non-response if they refuse to participate. So if I'm sitting at North High interviewing kids at lunch and I stop one and they refuse to answer my question, that was non-response. I, as the researcher, chose to ask them the question. They didn't choose to participate, but they did choose to not answer. Very good, very good. Okay, next one. The one where all the silly answers go is called response bias. Response bias happens when there is a consistent pattern of inaccurate responses to a survey question. And that can happen for lots and lots of reasons. First, humans lie. Not all of the time, not every day, but most of us at some point or another have done it. And people do it on surveys, sometimes to make them feel less stupid. If I'm interviewing kids about their GPA, maybe they'll lie because they're embarrassed about the grades, right? Like, just people do that. We have to be prepared for that as statisticians. If you are interviewing boomers, they are old. They may not remember things accurately. Memory can come into it. Different intent, right? They want to answer. They are attempting to answer honestly, but they can't remember. The last is that people may make up nonsense to answer a question they don't understand. Leaving it blank or asking the researcher alerts the researcher to the fact that the person doesn't understand, and then they don't feel great about themselves. And so sometimes they'll just make up an answer. Related to that is the idea of question wording bias. How you word a question can affect the responses that you get. We had issues with that in the 80s with all those child abuse cases where the investigators were asking leading questions. So they were leaking information to the person, letting that person know the kind of answer they're looking for. You mentioned something similar where somebody knows what the researcher's looking for and they want to help the researcher, and so they give the answer they think the researcher wants. Right? how we word our questions is going to affect the type of information we elicit. As a statistician, one way to combat that is write your question with several different types of wordings in different ways, in different manners, and perform a test case. Small sample, give each question to a subgroup, see the types of responses you're getting back. Are they the type of responses I was expecting? If not, maybe my question isn't asking what I thought it was asking. Go back to the drawing board. Yeah. Okay, for your unit project, we're going to get more into this. I'm going to give you a chance to write your own research questions and see what happens when you change the wording. We're going to investigate that wording bias a little bit more closely. But we are done with 3B. Yay! Questions? Thoughts? Concerns? No. Okay. I'm going to go back. You have the rest of class to work. You have a couple of things that are due today. Homework 3A, pumpkin picking activity, are small 10-pointers. The big one is the Unit 2 project. If you're turning it in person, you've got till the end of class. Otherwise, I'm headed to a meeting when the bell rings. Turn it into Google Classroom by midnight, yeah? If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, you've got time to work.